The central Andes between Argentina and Chile form a barrier that is not only high, but structurally repetitive. Long ridgelines stack behind one another. Glaciers sit in cirques like bowls. In clear weather, this creates crisp horizons and hard shadows. In cloud, the same terrain becomes flat and unreadable, with depth reduced to a near-white field. For aircraft and for search crews, the difference is decisive. The crash site lay at roughly 3,660 meters above sea level in a remote sector of the Andes in Argentina, close to the Chilean border. At that elevation, cold is not simply a discomfort. It governs metabolism, sleep, and cognition. Water exists mostly as ice. Wind turns exposed skin into a medical problem. Movement becomes expensive, measured in minutes of effort and hours of recovery. Even when an aircraft is known to be missing, the search problem here is geometric. Snow reduces contrast. A white fuselage can disappear against a glacier. Valleys close like pockets, and a plane can be hidden below a ridge that looks continuous from above. In October 1972, search aircraft did pass over the general region, but visual detection was unreliable, and official efforts were ended after 8 days. The mountains remained, unchanged and indifferent to human schedules. The journey began as a practical arrangement. The Old Christians Club, an amateur rugby team from Montevideo, planned to play a match in Santiago, Chile. To make the trip, a Uruguayan Air Force Fairchild Hiller FH-227D was chartered. The passenger list included members of the team and additional travelers, friends and relatives, bringing the total on board to 45. On October 12, 1972, the aircraft departed from Montevideo and flew toward Argentina. Weather over the Andes interrupted the schedule, and the flight stopped in Mendoza for the night. In this part of the world, delays caused by mountain weather were common. The route across the range was not simply a line on a map. It was constrained by cloud, by visibility, and by what the aircraft could safely clear when fully loaded. On Friday, October 13, the plane left Mendoza in the early afternoon. The planned crossing was typically flown as a longer path that reduced exposure to the highest terrain. Rather than heading directly west toward Santiago, the aircraft would track south and then turn back toward Chile through a lower pass, using radio navigation points to confirm position before beginning the approach northward. It was a standard compromise between geography and performance. In the cockpit, the flight also carried an internal purpose. The captain, Julio Cesar Ferradas, was experienced in Andean crossings. The co-pilot, Dante Hector Laguerara, was at the controls as part of a training context, with Ferradas accompanying him. With cloud obscuring the mountains below, navigation depended on instruments and radio beacons, and the margin for error narrowed. The cabin behind them had no reason to treat the Andes as anything more than landscape. There was no expedition equipment, no cold weather gear, and no plan for time on the ground. The passengers were traveling to a match, expecting a landing, and expecting the journey to end in a city. On Friday, October 13, 1972, the aircraft left Mendoza in the early afternoon and entered the Andes under cloud. For stretches of the crossing, the pilots could not confirm their position by sight. Navigation depended on instruments and radio beacons, with the mountains hidden below a layer that turned geography into abstraction. After crossing Planchon Pass, a positional error took shape in routine radio procedure. The co-pilot, Dante Hector Laguerara, believed the aircraft had reached Curacao, the point at which the route would turn north toward Santiago. The flight reported that position and requested descent clearance. With limited situational awareness available to controllers, the descent was authorized. The aircraft was still over high terrain. As it descended, turbulence increased. When the aircraft emerged from cloud, the proximity of the mountains was immediate. The crew applied power to climb, but the margin was gone. The aircraft struck a ridge, shedding structure in sequence, first the tail section and then both wings, before the remaining fuselage slid down snow and ice and came to rest in a glacial basin. The impact and breakup caused multiple fatalities and left many of the survivors with serious injuries. The fuselage, though damaged and open at the rear, became the only shelter available. The location was remote, high, and visually difficult to distinguish from the surrounding snowfields. In the days that followed, search aircraft would pass over the region without identifying the wreckage. The fuselage came to rest in a glacial basin at high altitude, with the broken structure acting as both refuge and boundary. Outside was open snow and rock. Inside was a narrow volume of torn metal, loose seats, luggage, and injured bodies. In the first hours after impact, the group's situation was defined less by long-term planning than by immediate triage and the basic physics of cold. At roughly 3,660 to 3,675 meters, night temperatures could drop sharply, and the shelter they had was incomplete. The tail section was missing, leaving an open end that had to be blocked with what remained. The survivors who could move began reorganizing the interior. Broken seats and debris were removed or shifted to make space. Luggage became insulation. Open gaps were packed with suitcases, seat parts, and snow. The fuselage was converted into a crude enclosure, described in the record as a small living space formed from what the crash left behind. It was not comfortable, but it was a system, a place where heat could accumulate and where wind could be reduced to a smaller problem. Medical capability was limited to the people on board. Among the survivors were Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino, both medical students, who worked quickly in the early period to assess injuries and prioritize what could be treated with the tools available. Many injuries were severe, broken limbs and trauma from seats driven forward during deceleration. Some passengers had wounds that could not be stabilized in those conditions. Even for those who lived, mobility was reduced. The crash did not leave them with a functioning camp, it left them with a damaged clinic, improvised from aircraft parts. The first routine tasks were about heat and water. Hydration at altitude cannot rely on chance. Snow must be converted into liquid, and fuel was scarce. One early improvisation recorded was a solar-powered water collector made using sheet metal retrieved from under the seats. The approach was simple: use sunlight to melt snow and capture the water, reducing the need to burn anything for heat. In the Andes, daylight is not warmth, but it is energy, and the survivors treated it as such. Vision was another practical constraint. Snow glare can disable people as effectively as injury, and they had very few pairs of sunglasses. An improvised solution is recorded: sunglasses cut from the cockpit's green plastic sun visors, stitched and wired into wearable form. It is the kind of adaptation that appears small in narration but matters in practice. Without eye protection, tasks like gathering supplies, digging, or scouting become limited by pain and temporary blindness. Their survival depended on maintaining a few essential human functions: seeing, walking, handling objects, under conditions that steadily stripped those functions away. Food in this early period was strictly limited and methodical. The supplies recovered were modest: chocolate bars, small jars of jam, a tin of mussels, almonds, dates, candy, dried plums, and wine. These were rationed, and the rationing quickly became a kind of discipline that substituted for certainty. Each day the arithmetic tightened. The plain was above the tree line. There was no wood, no vegetation to forage, and no animals to hunt. The landscape was bare in the practical sense. Calories came only from what had been carried in, and the quantity was enough for days, not weeks. Leadership in such a setting emerges through function rather than title. The rugby team captain, Marcelo Perez, is recorded as taking a leadership role in this initial phase. Others contributed through specific tasks: building, organizing, improvising, because the environment rewarded competence and penalized disorder. The fuselage became an enclosed community with rules shaped by necessity: who moved outside, who stayed in, who worked on water, who cared for the injured. While the survivors worked to stabilize their shelter, the outside world searched in a way that could not reliably see them. Aircraft did overfly the area, but the white fuselage lay against snow, and detection failed. The survivors attempted visible signals: an SOS written with lipstick, a cross fashioned in the snow, but neither produced rescue. After 8 days, official search efforts were called off. This fact would become known to the group later, but the early pattern was already established. Inside the fuselage, small systems and routines were forming. Outside, the mountain remained difficult to read from the air. Inside the fuselage, time was measured in short, repeated tasks. The same small space had to serve as shelter, infirmary, and storehouse. Outside, the landscape offered little that could be converted into food. At that altitude there was no vegetation, and no animals to hunt. What had been edible on the aircraft was finite and steadily disappearing. The survivors rationed what they had recovered, small packaged items and a few bottles, until the supply was gone in roughly a week. Attempts to chew leather or seat materials made them ill and did not solve the underlying problem of calories. Their relationship to rescue shifted in stages. They had already watched aircraft pass over the mountains without stopping. They had tried to create signals large enough to be seen from the air, including an SOS written with lipstick and a cross-shaped mark on the snow. None brought help. The fuselage's white surface, close in tone to the surrounding snowfields, reduced the chances of being spotted even when aircraft were near. A small transistor radio became the one link to outside information. It was found jammed between seats, and an improvised antenna was created from aircraft wire. On the 11th day after the crash, the survivors heard confirmed news that official search efforts had been called off after 8 days. It was not a rumor carried by weather or guesswork. It was a broadcast. The implication was practical. Waiting was no longer a plan. With the disappearance of rescue as a near-term expectation, the group faced a choice they had deferred while the last rations remained. They were in an environment where starvation progresses predictably. Without external food sources, the body consumes itself. In that setting, the only available reserves were the bodies of those who had died in the crash and in the days after. The decision to eat the dead is documented as deliberate and discussed among them, not an impulsive act. It was framed as a survival measure taken after other options had ended. They used broken glass as cutting tools. The meat was taken in small pieces, and often dried in the sun to make it easier to consume and to preserve it. The act was approached with reluctance and religious concern. Most passengers were Roman Catholic, and some feared spiritual consequences. The historical record notes that they sought ways to interpret the decision within their beliefs, including comparisons to religious concepts familiar to them. Not everyone accepted it immediately, but those who survived ultimately did so on that basis. Was also a moment when their internal organization tightened. Food, now harvested and distributed under strict control, became the center of routine. It was no longer a matter of dividing snacks. It was a form of rationing that carried moral weight and required coordination: who cut it, who received it, and how much could be consumed without exhausting the only remaining supply before any exit attempt could be made. The decision did not end hardship. It extended time. It allowed the group to continue the daily work of keeping shelter intact, producing water, and assessing whether movement across the mountains was possible. With food reduced to what they could no longer replace, the group's remaining options narrowed to movement. Staying beside the fuselage meant accepting a static position in a place that had already defeated aerial search. Leaving meant walking into terrain none of them had planned to enter on foot, at altitude, in improvised clothing, while weakened by injury and hunger. The decision to attempt movement did not arrive as a single turning point. It formed through repeated observations: aircraft did not return, signals did not work, and the landscape offered no local supply of fuel or edible plants. They began surveying what lay around the crash site in short excursions, limited by cold and the steepness of the glacier. The fuselage sat inside a cirque, surrounded by walls of snow and rock. In multiple directions, routes rose into ridges that looked, from below, like possible exits. The survivors also carried a critical navigational misunderstanding for much of the ordeal. Because the co-pilot had reported being near Curacao before the crash, some believed the Chilean side might be close to the west. In reality, the aircraft had come down deep within the Andes, and the distance to lower ground in Chile was far greater than they assumed. That misreading shaped early expectations and delayed a clear sense of what any journey would require. Preparation therefore became its own survival routine. The tools were the plane itself, broken glass for cutting, metal for melting snow and catching water, seat materials for insulation, electrical wire for repairs, and cushions used as makeshift protection for travel on snow. A small, enclosed shelter could be improved day by day, but it could not be moved. Any departure would need a way to sleep outside the fuselage and carry calories over multiple days. It also required choosing who could walk. Many were injured. Those with the best strength and mobility became the only viable candidates for long travel, while the rest depended on them. By late October, the fuselage was no longer simply wreckage. It was a sealed habitat maintained by routine, blocking openings, melting snow into water, rationing what could be rationed, and limiting exposure to wind and glare. The survivors' safety depended on staying inside during the worst cold and leaving only when tasks required it. In the Andes, that strategy reduces risk from exposure, but it increases dependence on a single shelter that cannot be moved and cannot absorb a major structural shock. On the night of October 29, 1972, an avalanche struck the fuselage while the survivors were asleep. Snow and ice poured into the cabin and almost completely filled the interior, reducing airspace to a narrow pocket near the ceiling. 8 people were smothered in the aircraft: Enrique Platero, Liliana Methol, Gustavo Nicolich, Daniel Maspons, Juan Menendez, Diego Storm, Carlos Roque, and Marcelo Perez. Perez had served as a central organizer in the early period, and Methol had been a key caregiver for the injured. Their deaths altered both the group's structure and its practical capacity. The survivors who remained alive were trapped inside the buried fuselage and quickly confronted a mechanical problem rather than an abstract one: air. They attempted to create ventilation by reaching the cockpit area. Nando Paradu used a metal pole to pry at a windscreen and to poke a hole through the packed snow for fresh air. 2 days later, by October 31, they managed to dig an exit tunnel from the cockpit to the surface. When they broke through, they faced a blizzard and had to retreat back inside, sealing themselves again in the same confined space, now with bodies inside the aircraft. For 3 days, the storm conditions held. The fuselage remained buried, and movement outside was effectively impossible. The avalanche therefore did more than kill. It forced the survivors into sustained confinement and removed the remaining illusion that the shelter was stable. After this, leadership shifted to others, including Daniel Fernandez and cousins Eduardo and Fido Strauch, who took on responsibility for distributing food and managing essential tasks. The group's daily system continued, but now under the knowledge that the mountain could enter their shelter without warning. In early December, the survivors' preparations for a walking escape turned into action. The group had been living for weeks in a fixed position at high altitude, dependent on a shelter that could be buried, and on food that could not be replaced. On December 12, 1972, 2 of them, Nando Paradu and Roberto Canessa, left the crash site to seek help. They were not equipped as mountaineers. Their plan depended on the limited materials available from the aircraft wreck and on choosing the only direction that seemed to offer a chance of reaching inhabited valleys. Their first task was vertical. From the fuselage, they climbed steep slopes, gaining height toward a ridge line west of the crash basin. The record notes that they climbed for 3 days, ascending roughly 839 meters from the crash site up steep gradients to a ridge around 4,503 meters. The climb corrected a false sense of proximity. From higher ground, the Andes did not open quickly into lowland. The view extended into repeated ranges, and the scale of the journey became clearer. From that ridge, they continued westward. Their distance is described in the historical summaries as approximately 53.9 kilometers over 7 more days into Chile before finding help. The figure compresses what the walk required in practice: steady movement while weakened, carrying what food they could, sleeping exposed to cold, and navigating without formal maps. The terrain also changed along the route, glacier to rock, snowfield to valley, and each change demanded time and effort. On December 20, 1972, the trek ended in contact. Paradu and Canessa encountered people in Chile near Los Maidens, after days of travel. The first communication occurred across a river whose noise made spoken words difficult to exchange. The men on horseback indicated they would return. The next morning, communication was completed by written notes thrown across the river, an exchange that moved the situation from private survival to official notification. Authorities were alerted soon after. From that point, the stranded group at the fuselage was no longer solely responsible for its own extraction. The problem became one of rescue aviation and timing, with helicopters and weather determining how quickly the remaining survivors could be reached and transported out. The trek had done what weeks of waiting could not. It had carried verifiable information from the glacier to the inhabited world. On the 22nd and the 23rd of December 1972, helicopters reached the crash area and evacuated the remaining survivors. The extraction happened in stages, constrained by flying conditions in the mountains. By the end of the second day of operations, 16 people had survived out of the 45 who had been aboard the aircraft. The date range attached to the event, October 13 to December 23, 1972, captures how the incident is documented not only as a crash, but as a sustained survival period shaped by altitude, cold, injury, and scarcity. Public understanding of what happened changed after the rescues, when it became known that the survivors had eaten the bodies of those who died. The historical record describes the decision as a response to starvation after the limited food carried on the aircraft was exhausted, and after official aerial search failed to locate them. Initial public reaction included condemnation, followed by broader recognition that the act had been undertaken in an environment with no alternative nutrition. The incident's international attention became inseparable from this fact, and from the way it forced audiences to confront the distance between ordinary moral life and conditions of extreme isolation. In later retellings, the emphasis often rests on structure, how a small society formed in the fuselage, how labor was divided, and how purpose narrowed toward survival and, eventually, self-rescue. Survivor interviews recorded decades later describe a group shaped by routine, water collection, improvised equipment, radio monitoring, and the eventual decision to send an expedition for help. The wreck's location, high in the Andes near the Chilean border, in a glacial basin recorded on maps and photographs, remains a fixed point in the historical record. Much of the story is therefore not interpretation. It is geography, dates, and a documented sequence of practical decisions. When the event ends, it does not resolve into a triumph. It closes as a verified survival that carried permanent consequences for those involved and a permanent place in modern disaster history.